Highbridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Black Death at the Golden Gate, The Race to Save America from the Bubonic Plague, by David K. Randall, read by Charles Constant. Such was the cruelty of heaven that between March and July upwards of 100,000 souls perished. What magnificent dwellings, what noble places were then depopulated, what families became extinct, what riches and vast possessions were left and no heir to inherit them, what numbers in the prime and giver of youth breakfasted in the morning with living friends, and supped at night with their departed friends in the other world. Giovanni Boccaccio, The Decameron. Prologue. Fighting the Devil with Fire. On the morning of December 8th, 1899, Yuk Hoi, a 40-year-old bookkeeper, awoke in his bed to the flash of a high fever and a mysterious swelling in his thigh. Unable to do much more than mumble, he laid his head down and drifted in and out of sleep, largely ignored by the other men crammed into a windowless room of a 2-story flophouse in Honolulu's overstuffed Chinatown. Having arrived just weeks before from his native China, Yuk Hoi had few friends in the bustling city, and his absence over the following days went unnoticed at the general store on Mauna Kea Street where he worked. Only his increasingly frantic cries alerted others to the misery of his existence. Woken by his wails, a man named Fong, who lived on the same floor, stumbled in darkness to find him trembling in a litter of straw, his body quivering, as Fong would later describe it, like the branches of a tree in thunder and lightning gone crazy. Fong lifted the man and made his way by moonlight along the unpaved streets of Chinatown to the office of Dr. Li Kai-Fai on River Street 1 block away. Tall and fiery, Dr. Li was one of the few Chinese doctors trained in Western medicine that could be found in Hawaii, and he made little effort to hide his contempt for traditional Chinese healers whom he saw as clinging to a backward way of life. One of the few conciliations he made to what he regarded as superstition was to allow a friend to paint the table in the front room of his office deep red, the color of good luck. Other than that, his small office, only 12 feet across, was like that of any other Western-trained doctor, with a shelf full of books in English and a shiny brass spittoon by the front door. Dr. Li was alone when Fong burst in and laid Yuk Hoi in front of him. The man was covered in feces and vomit and raved in apparent madness. Dr. Li struggled to hold his new patient still, all the while wondering how he was still alive. A finger to his wrist revealed a racing pulse, as if the body was facing an internal terror, while his forehead was so warm to the touch that Dr. Li fought the instinct to pull his hand away. When Yuk Hoi yelled, his screams sounded wet, as if emerging from below the sea. The man's skin, which days before had glimmered in the balmy Hawaiian sun, was pocked with black spots and open red sores, leaving the line between bodily tissue and the outside world an unsettled question. The lymph nodes in his thigh were so swollen that it looked as if his leg had been pumped full of air and was at risk of floating away. A mixture of blood and foam began leaking out of his mouth, a sign of ruptured blood vessels, and he soon fell into a coma from which Dr. Li knew he would never recover. The doctor shuddered, wishing that what he saw before him was not real. He was one of only a handful of people then living in Hawaii who had seen the full power of the disease killing the man in front of him, and his knowledge had come at great personal cost. At the age of 9, he had watched as his father, whose conversion to Christianity had led others in their village in southern China to call him a running dog of the white devils, came under attack by a mob that stoned him to death in the street. His mother fled with her 4 children to Hong Kong, and at the age of 16, Li enrolled in the Canton Medical School, a school of Western medicine founded by an American doctor from Ohio. There he met his future wife, Dr. Kong Tai-hyong, who in time would be at his side to witness death on a scale neither could have imagined. Short where he was tall, reserved where he was loud, Dr. Kong was the physical opposite of her husband, yet she was widely seen as his intellectual superior. Left in a basket on the steps of a Lutheran mission in Hong Kong as an infant with nothing more than a pin bearing her name, she had grown up helping German nuns care for other children in her orphanage. They, in turn, helped her apply to the Canton Medical School. There she was known as the most brilliant student in her class, and, with Li, spent her off hours tending to victims of the epidemic ravaging Hong Kong that left hospitals reporting a 95% death rate. The pair graduated from medical school one June morning and were married in a Lutheran chapel that same afternoon. The following day they boarded a steamship headed to Hawaii, drawn by its promise of paradise after the hell they had seen. They entered Honolulu weeks later to the sound of cannon blasts, each one marking the island's celebration of the American Independence Day. There was no doubt in Lee's mind that the disease that he had prayed would never follow him had now come ashore. Since arriving in Honolulu, he had built up his practice ministering to poor Chinese immigrants who were suspicious of the small but powerful group of white merchants and missionaries who, 2 years earlier, had overthrown Hawaii's monarchy in hopes of American annexation. Any cooperation with the new government would be seen as a betrayal and put him at risk of meeting the same fate as his father. Despite that danger and the late hour, Dr. Lee summoned Dr. George Herbert, an English physician who worked for the Board of Health. By the time he arrived, Yuk Hoi was dead. Dr. Herbert called in 2 other colleagues and, with Dr. Lee, prepared the examining table to conduct an autopsy in the small hours of the night. By the flickering light of kerosene lanterns, the team of white doctors stood shoulder to shoulder and watched as Dr. Lee opened the body and peeled back its skin to reveal signs of extensive internal hemorrhaging. Dr. Lee pointed to the black marks on the arms, the dried blood in the mouth, and the swollen lymph nodes in the armpits, neck, and groin. The procedure finished, Dr. Lee told the men in front of him in his halting English that the man's symptoms perfectly matched those he had seen among the dead of Hong Kong. His voice echoed in the silent room. Dr. Walter Hoffman, a young German doctor just 4 months into his job as Honolulu's first bacteriologist, stepped forward to take a sample of tissue from the glands of the dead man. His laboratory across town was the only place on the island that could confirm what every doctor assembled that night now believed. For the first time in history, bubonic plague had reached Hawaii, bringing with it the capacity to kill everyone they loved in a matter of days. On the eve of the modern era, one of the most feared diseases in human history returned without warning and unleashed death on a scale not seen in centuries. Bubonic plague appeared in the rural province of Yunnan in south-central China in the late 1870s, where it festered for nearly 2 decades before making its way across the globe. By 1893, it had reached the city of Canton, where, in the words of one observer, it killed thousands of people like plum blossoms in a late frost. From there, the disease traveled along the Pearl River to Hong Kong, and then on board steamships to the wider world. In China, some 10 million people died within a span of 5 years. By the end of 1910, another 5 million would perish as plague emerged in India, Australia, Scotland, and North Africa, sparking fears that the Black Death, a 14th-century worldwide outbreak of plague that in some areas killed 60% of the population, had returned. The disease seemed to arrive with no cause and overwhelm the body with no cure. In 1894, a tiny rod-shaped bacterium known as Yersinia pestis was identified as the source of plague, but beyond that, little else. How the disease spread, who was most likely to contract it, or whether any medicines could dent its progress, was known. Doctors engulfed in the first clash between the ancient disease and modern medicine were left to experiment for themselves, knowing all the while that millions of lives hung in the balance. Coming at a time when public health officials were widely distrusted, during the smallpox epidemic of 1894-95 in Milwaukee, Polish women armed with baseball bats and butcher knives patrolled the streets, ready to combat health inspectors they feared were using disease as a cover to confiscate their homes and belongings. The fight against plague would prove to be a battle over the legitimacy of science, laying the foundation for a century of public health improvements that extended the lifespan of the average American by nearly 30 years. With so much about the disease a mystery, its name alone was spoken with dread. Though few living at the time had any first-hand experience with plague prior to its reappearance, the trail of dead that it had once left in its wake made it seem like nothing short of divine wrath. A 1665 outbreak of plague in London sparked terror so great that the courage of the people appointed to carry away the dead began to fail them. Nay, several of them died, although they had the distemper before and were recovered. and some of them dropped down when they had been carrying the bodies even at the pit side and just ready to throw them in. And this confusion was greater in the city, because they had flattered themselves with hopes of escaping and thought the bitterness of death was past, wrote Daniel Defoe in Journal of the Plague Year, 57 years after the epidemic. Prejudice often filled in the blanks. Puzzled by the fact that few upper-class foreigners living in colonial compounds in Hong Kong and India caught the disease even as thousands around them succumbed, some public health officials drew the pseudoscientific conclusion that those with European ancestry had somehow developed immunity to plague and pointed to their survival as proof of racial superiority. In 1897, the powers of Europe, nervous at the thought of allowing someone bearing the disease across their borders, agreed to impose travel restrictions on goods and people that codified this theory into law, allowing upper-class whites free passage from plague-stricken areas while denying entry to everyone else. With its arrival in Chinatown, the path of plague in Honolulu seemed to confirm what many white Hawaiians already suspected. On the night of Yuk Hoi's death, another Chinese bookkeeper was found dead with the same symptoms just blocks away. 5 additional victims were discovered over the next 4 days, all of them Chinese men, except for one 24-year-old man who had days before arrived from the Gilbert Islands, some 2,000 miles away. The Board of Health ordered a 5-day quarantine of Chinatown, trapping an estimated 10,000 men and women in the space of 8 city blocks. Armed guards stood with fixed bayonets at the edge of the district, intent on keeping anyone infected with the disease from spreading it beyond its borders. A mob soon gathered outside the office of Dr. Lee, the man they now blamed for their confinement. The doctor jumped on his bicycle and raced away, barely escaping with his life. As rumors of an imminent riot bubbled through the city, the Board of Health counted down the days until it could lift the quarantine, hoping that their nightmare would soon end. On the day that the barriers were set to come down, a German teenager named Ethel Johnson developed a suspiciously high fever. The modest Johnson home was on Iwole Road, a street just outside the quarantine zone that bent from the edge of Chinatown toward the harbor. Wagons filled with human waste collected from the toilets of the district were a common sight traveling past the house en route to a seaside dump. A team of doctors sent to the girl's home found suspicious lumps in her armpits and groin, leaving them no choice but to identify her as a possible case of plague. A phalanx of soldiers formed a barrier around the Johnson home, blocking anyone from entering or leaving the residence, despite the protests of a physician at the Board of Health who found it an insult to group the girl together with Hawaiians, Japanese, and Chinese, an act which would defile the dignity of her whiteness, the people who control and rule this archipelago. Ethel Johnson died 5 days later. Other deaths followed in rapid succession, like dominoes spreading across a table. On Christmas Eve, a 27-year-old Chinese laborer named Ah Fong fell dead in a vegetable garden. On Christmas Day, the body of a 24-year-old Chinese man named Chong Mon Dao was found in a shack, placed there by one of the 16 other men who shared a room with him in Chinatown. The next day, doctors at the Wai Hua Yi Yuan Hospital in Chinatown discovered the body of a 25-year-old man dumped in the street outside its gate, teeming with plague. With the quarantine ineffectual, the Board of Health panicked, consumed by the prospect of the islands becoming overwhelmed by a disease that seemed to have no cure. The men then turned to what even they agreed was a solution that would have seemed crazy 6 weeks before: fire. No science could point to its efficacy, and no city had ever tried it before, but the prospect of burning the disease away satisfied some deep urge. Nathaniel Emerson, the eldest member of the board, stood at a podium before the group of men who effectively ruled all of Hawaii. The son of missionaries from New England, he was one of the few white adults who had been born on the islands and had sailed east to attend Williams College in his parents' native Massachusetts. While he was there, the Civil War broke out, and he enlisted in defense of a nation to which his home did not technically belong. Scars from Confederate artillery shrapnel that wounded him during the Battle of Gettysburg still traced his body. He returned to the islands years later, after earning a medical degree at Harvard and then working as a private physician in Manhattan. He brought with him a thoroughly Yankee sensibility, which often seemed out of place in a land of sugarcane and pineapple. At the age of 60, he no longer feared the social consequences of his actions and prided himself on his independence. "I am willing to go right ahead and take all the responsibility and burn anything and do anything that is necessary," he told the men seated before him. One by one, his colleagues agreed. They would burn every building suspected of harboring plague to the ground immediately, regardless of the owner's wishes, praying that fire could do what medicine so far could not. On the morning of Saturday, December 31st, local firemen ignited a pair of two-story buildings where a man named Ah Kao had been found dead of plague a few days before. The buildings were home to 85 Chinese, Japanese, and Hawaiians, who were all taken to a makeshift quarantine station that resembled a prison. English-language newspapers cheered the new policy, with the commercial advertiser calling it "fighting the devil with fire." As the flames overwhelmed the buildings, black smoke rose high into the deep blue skies. Fire was the city's last hope, and no one knew if it would work. No New Year's Eve celebrations were held in Honolulu that evening, the final night of the 19th century. The only sound in the deserted city's streets was that of a Portuguese band, playing the wailing notes of a funeral dirge. Chapter 1. Across the Sea. His banishment now felt complete. 6 weeks earlier, Joseph Kenyon had been heading into middle age, ensconced in a bubble of his own brilliance. Widely seen as one of the most accomplished scientists in the United States, at the age of 39, he was still young enough to expect that his achievements were a prelude to greatness. He spent his days in a laboratory built to his specifications, which was without question the finest in North America, located so close to the Capitol building that the view from his fourth-story window consisted of little more than its blinding white rotunda. At night he went with his wife Lizzie to the finest restaurants in Washington, where he spent hours in conversation with sitting senators, his reputation as one of the youngest to ever climb the ranks of the Marine Hospital Service, an entryway to the social heights of a city that still felt Southern a generation after the Civil War. He expected nothing less than for his life to continue along the same upward trajectory that it always had. One order from Surgeon General Walter Wyman, the only man who outranked him in the Marine Hospital Service, the precursor to the modern U.S. Public Health Service, changed all that. Kenyon had worked with Wyman for more than a decade, fulfilling his orders without question and offering advice when asked. Wyman marveled at the laboratory skills of Kenyon, which he knew he would never be able to match, yet was unable to temper his envy as he watched Kenyon's star outshine his own. At the age of 51, Wyman was a lifelong bachelor who, over his 9 years heading the Marine Hospital Service, had set rules governing every aspect of the job, down to the proper wording of memos and the correct angle at which the dress uniform's ceremonial sword should hang from an officer's hip. Suspicious of any threat to his control, Wyman developed a habit of issuing sudden transfer orders to any officer who gained public acclaim, leaving one longtime service member to say, "He found out where you didn't want to go, and he sent you there." Wyman's resentment of Kenyon built slowly over several years, and then cascaded down shortly after the Journal of the American Medical Association, a publication read by every doctor in the country and by the Marine Hospital Service officers posted at more than 20 ports overseas, published an issue in which it repeatedly referred to Kenyon as the true Surgeon General and called Wyman unfit for his job. Though Kenyon had never outwardly encouraged the attention, Wyman drew up a letter in early May of 1899 notifying him that he was to immediately report to a new station on the other side of the country. For the rest of his life, Wyman would take pains to avoid mentioning Kenyon by name. A hastily arranged farewell dinner was held in Kenyon's honor in an upstairs ballroom at Rauscher's, a French restaurant then at the top of Washington's social hierarchy. 50 of the most lauded doctors in the country, a group that included George Sternberg, the sitting U.S. Army Surgeon General, and Z.T. Sowers, whose work championing the accurate labeling of drugs would lead to the creation of the Food and Drug Administration, listened while Professor George M. Kobe, soon to be dean of the Georgetown Medical School, reminded the group of Kenyon's genius. No member of his corps has contributed more to the reputation of the Marine Hospital Service and helped to place it upon a higher scientific plane than Dr. Kenyon, he said. In an understated dig at Wyman, who did not attend the ceremony, he added, "It seems a pity, therefore, that this modest, unassuming scientist should be divorced from a laboratory which has already accomplished so much and promised still more for the future usefulness of this branch of the public service." Kobe revealed to the men around him that Kenyon had received the tempting offer of a full professorship at Rush Medical College in Chicago, yet turned it down because he felt that his first duty was to the public welfare of his country. Men of this type are rare in the world, especially in these days of struggle for wealth and fame, when the accelerated speed of the race has quickened the pulse, stimulated the nerves, and fired the ambition of men until they overleap all limits of propriety, he said. It is not so with our honored guest, for he evidently belongs to the descendants of that noble band of patriots, ready to defend a principle with their lives, their fortune, and their sacred honor. Before the month was over, Kenyon, along with his pregnant wife and 3 young children, climbed aboard a train bound for San Francisco and a coast they had never before seen. They reached California 12 days later, following long stops in Denver and Salt Lake City to allow Lizzie to get some rest. Even with their unexpected delay, their new quarters at the Marine Hospital Station in San Francisco were not ready when they arrived. The city itself seemed unwilling to greet them, consumed by a dense fog and chilly wind that felt like a closed door. A small earthquake that jolted the city the next day only confirmed the sense that California wanted nothing to do with them. The Kenyon family spent several days at the enormous Palace Hotel, which stretched across an entire city block at the corner of Market and Montgomery Streets downtown, and offered a level of elegance that prompted the steel magnate Andrew Carnegie to once proclaim, "There is no hotel building in the world greater than this." Kenyon, however, found the pageantry of the place an affront to his natural frugality, and shepherded his family toward the docks as soon as he received word that their new home was ready. The family boarded a private ferry for the 30-minute trip to Angel Island, a hilly star-shaped outpost that would be their home for the foreseeable future. There, on the largest island in the San Francisco Bay, Kenyon took charge of the 32-building complex that made up the most extensive quarantine station in the country, and which was responsible for inspecting all passengers and goods arriving through the Golden Gate. Before leaving Washington, Kenyon had extracted a promise from Wyman that he would be able to continue his laboratory research in California as time permitted. Upon arrival, however, he realized that would be impossible. The wharf where the ferryboat docked, and indeed the island's only connection to the outside world, was so close to tumbling down that Kenyon wondered if it was even possible to land. The station itself, meanwhile, was running dangerously short of water, holding so little reserve supplies that a malfunction of one of the hundreds of kerosene lamps required in the absence of electric light threatened to burn down the entire wooden complex. Microscopes and other laboratory equipment sat untouched in dirt-covered boxes. No working telephone or telegraph connected the island to the mainland, and the boats quarantine officers used to meet incoming vessels were so slow and top-heavy that they risked injury every time they went on patrol. Every ship that appeared out of the fog stitched through the Golden Gate made the situation worse. Dozens of passengers on board a steamship from Hawaii might be discharged on the island at the same time as a crew of merchant sailors from Japan and the members of a Russian whaling party returning from Alaska, the jumble of languages and smells leaving Kenyon all the more unmoored. The world arrived at his doorstep by the hour, united only by the fact that no one wanted to spend another minute waiting for inspections before they were allowed clear passage on to San Francisco. If he did need to treat a sick passenger, he had little to offer. The main hospital on the island was in shambles, with patients infected with communicable diseases sharing small rooms with men and women there for quarantine, a layout that practically begged for illness to spread. Every night, Kenyon retreated to a small wooden barrack that served as his new home, where a cold wind from the bay seeped through the walls and left him perpetually worried that his children were about to fall sick. Worse yet, he did not know what else lay in store for him. Simply making a full tour of the island was rendered nearly impossible after a surprise summer rain washed the dirt roads away. Adding to Kenyon's humiliation, he soon discovered that dozens of acres of the otherwise pristine and uninhabited island were covered in garbage, the only remaining evidence of the thousands of troops who had passed through quarantine after returning from the Philippines at the conclusion of the Spanish-American War. The kind of scientific progress that had propelled his rise was now replaced by the opportunity to clean up trash, all the while literally marooned on an island on the other side of the continent from everyone and everything he considered important. I heard a joke which I consider quite a good one on me a few days ago, and that was that rumor had reached San Francisco that I had been sent here by the Surgeon General to be buried, Kenyon wrote to a friend in Washington as he began work on bringing the station up to his standards. Don't you think that I have been a rather lively corpse, if that was the reason? In many ways, Kenyon's levity masked a rawness that had not diminished with age. With his thinning brown hair, stocky body, and gold wire-rim glasses perched above a trim, dark beard, Kenyon looked more the part of a member of the Eastern elite than his life history would suggest. His unquestioning self-confidence had launched him from the humblest beginnings, and now sustained him as he faced the indignity of his new surroundings. It was not the first time that his personality had provoked scorn. At a time when there were few men or women in America that he considered his intellectual equals, he was accustomed to being right, and, like many researchers whose brilliance is most apparent in the laboratory, he lacked the social intelligence to smooth over disagreements. As a result, he often tangled even with those who liked him, flashing a stubbornness that frequently threatened to push his objectives further out of view. The sudden posting to San Francisco, which he considered a public rebuke by Wyman, only brought the darker aspects of his personality to the surface. His willfulness had been fostered by a childhood marked by upheaval. He was born on the eve of the Civil War in the remote hill country of East Bend, North Carolina, into a wealthy family that owned slaves. When Joseph was 5 months old, his father, John, left his small medical practice to join the Confederate Army, in whose service he fought in 13 successive battles before resigning as a captain to work as a surgeon at a hospital in the rebel capital of Richmond, Virginia. He was among the thousands of men who surrendered to General Sherman in Durham, North Carolina, immediately following Lincoln's assassination, and soon returned to East Bend, only to discover that his home had been burned down and nearly all of his farmland destroyed. After a brief stint in Texas, John Kenyon resettled his family in the frontier town of Oak Township, Missouri, where he made his living splitting railroad ties for about $1 a day. The small town, nestled near the Kansas border, had been settled mostly by refugees from southern states, and soon became a lawless place of vigilante justice among men who refused to let the Civil War die. There Joseph Kenyon spent his childhood in a small log cabin, where he devoured Greek and Roman classics and taught himself French, German, and Spanish as an escape from the violence all around him. At the age of 16, he began to study medicine under his father's tutelage, a common practice at a time when most would-be physicians learned their craft in informal apprenticeships like blacksmiths. Under his father's guidance, he learned how to diagnose common ailments, how to clean a wound, and, most importantly, how to be quick with a knife when anesthesia was an indulgence. By the age of 21, he was ready to move to New York City to study at Bellevue Hospital, one of the few places in the country that could offer formal research experience at a time when most hospitals were sparse, primitive wards. In New York, Kenyon took the first steps in his transformation from country doctor into one of the giants of the burgeoning era of medicine in which laboratory skills would prove to be more consequential than bedside manner. He took courses in microbiology, analytical chemistry, and infectious diseases, becoming one of the first Americans to harness the power of the microscope to target bacteria, which had only recently been identified as the true cause of disease. He graduated from Bellevue in the spring of 1882 and returned home to practice medicine in Missouri. The loss of his first patient that winter, a young girl suffering from diphtheria, among the deadliest of childhood diseases, left him so depressed that he nearly quit the field. He consoled himself by buying a microscope, which was then considered more a toy for the idle rich than a crucial tool for medicine, and immersed himself in the study of agricultural diseases like anthrax and chicken cholera, all the while supporting himself by tending to women in labor for the price of $10 per delivery. Within 3 years he was married to Susan Elizabeth Perry, the daughter of a prominent Missouri family, who asked that everyone call her Lizzie, and ready to break out of a comfortable rural existence that offered few avenues for intellectual adventure. He returned to New York in 1885 as a newly married man to study as one of the first students at the Bacteriological Research Laboratory at Bellevue, funded by Andrew Carnegie. It soon became clear that his timing could not have been better. The word bacteriology had appeared before 1886, but the subject had no existence anywhere much before that time, noted William Thompson Sedgwick, one of the founders of the Harvard School of Public Health, in an early history of the field. A little more than 200 years earlier, a Dutch tradesman and amateur scientist by the name of Anton van Leeuwenhoek had been the first to identify bacteria after experimenting with samples of lake water under an early microscope. Yet it would take more than a century for his discovery to find its application within medicine. With a previously unseen world now in view, the concept of disease began to morph from the medieval theory of miasma, the idea that so-called bad air spread infection, to pinpointing the exact bacilli that caused illness. The new field of bacteriology focused more on cells than on the individual attributes of patients, and concerned itself chiefly with understanding how bacteria functioned in order to defeat it. Established doctors at the time considered this approach.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?